Welcome back to the Rollup High Roller community. As always, nothing on the Rollup is to be construed as financial advice. We are just some educators in the DeFi space. Toss us a quick like, give us a share, a repost, send it to a friend who may want to watch this, and finally, give us a sub or a follow. It means the world to help support credibly neutral educational content in DeFi. We're here to educate, empower, and enrich you, and let's jump in.
Welcome to DeFi by Design, where we talk all things blockchain and cryptocurrency while striving to educate, empower, and enrich.
What's going on, guys? Welcome back to the DeFi by Design podcast. Here with Rob, the dual penguins today. We've got a wild Charles from Espresso. Seems to have made his way out of his zoo and into his human form. GM, all excited to talk about Modular Thesis today. Yeah, man, Charles, how you doing? Things are getting a little wild out there.
Good. Yes, things are wild, though. I haven't had much time to, stay tuned with all the crazy things going on in the markets these days. We have been pretty busy internally trying to ship. But yeah, GM and unfortunately, I do not own a pudgy penguin, but maybe I should consider buying one. Though they are a little expensive now.
Yeah, at least you don't have the Bored Ape. Shots where flip those, Rob. We're gonna just flip them right over their heads.
It's for almost there, buddy. Yeah, man. Well, Charles, co-founder of Espresso. I've got a Cuban espresso today. It's my coffee of choice.
Love it.
How did the espresso name come to be? Is it? Yeah. Before I start speculating,
we had struggled for a long time to name the project. We've been around for over 3 years now, and I think Espresso only came to be 1 year in. Back then we were still focused on privacy, though we still were working on Hotshot. We've actually been working on Hotshot, the consensus protocol that underlies the Espresso sequencer since the very beginning. But back then it was for a different purpose, but we ended up realizing it was, perfect for sequencing. And, Hotshot, you kind of had the Espresso shot right there. So I guess that was kind of the predecessor to Espresso, but it was just a random name, and I think it's a really nice name. Espresso kind of gives you the feeling that it's super fast, super responsive. So that's really what we're trying to do here with Espresso and sequencing.
Should have just called it Adderall. When I think of Espresso, I think of a super instant theorem-aligned, positive sum, public good vibe. How did you guys go about crafting that brand and that kind of, aura of this? And perhaps can correct me if there's a different way that you kind of feel that the market looks at Espresso.
That's a great characterization, and it's great to hear that you feel that way. Ethereum alignment is extremely important to us, and maybe I should start by saying why Espresso and what we're trying to build here. But basically, what we're building is a shared decentralized sequencer. The two key parts, the keywords are really shared and decentralized. But we're on the Rollup podcast. Rollups are huge. Back 2 years, we would have never imagined that Rollups are having the transaction volume that we're seeing today. And, on many metrics, the aggregate of activity on layer 2 Rollups right now is actually overtaking, layer 1s like Ethereum. And that is incredible. And it is also scary for a couple of reasons. First of all, pretty much all rollups right now are still running on centralized sequencers. And what that means is the entity or the software that determines the ordering of transactions is basically being run by a single, single service. Probably not a single server, there might be multiple, but they're still operated by the same entity, whether it be the foundation behind the rollup or the development company. And there are a lot of risks to that. So that is one reason why we are looking to decentralize. And then the other concern is that, there is a lot of, fragmentation going on in the ecosystem. A year ago, maybe there were 2, 3 live major rollups. Now we're seeing tens, we're seeing hundreds. And it is extremely difficult to move value and to sort of interoperate between these rollups. And that is where the part about being a shared sequencer comes in. With rollups, sharing the same sequencing infrastructure, we actually get a lot of interoperability benefits as well. So that is why we're trying to address kind of both shared and decentralized sequencing, and we'll get into that a little later. One other thing on back to your question, Andy, which was on Ethereum alignment. The vast majority of rollups right now are basically settling to Ethereum, but as I mentioned, a lot of transaction activity and as a result, fees are actually going to the rollups, and very little is going out of that is going to Ethereum. Certainly, rollups are paying a lot for data availability, but longer term, the trend is, as we see with all the data availability solutions coming out, towards cheaper and cheaper DA and also alternative data availability solutions. And one concern, and this is, it is more theoretical, but I believe it will become a very practical concern soon, is that if all of this value is being captured by the rollups and not all of that is coming back to the base layers like Ethereum, that is a concern because ultimately what underlies the security for rollups is the base layer, like Ethereum, and it's important to stay incentive aligned with Ethereum. So to that end, one thing that is on our roadmap is restaking, allowing restaking of Ethereum restake validators to play a big role and enjoy some of the rewards from operating sequencing infrastructure for rollups. And we believe that'll help align the incentives and make sure that the ecosystem is growing for everyone. So that is why I believe we're super focused on being part of the Ethereum ecosystem and the community, and making sure that we're incentive aligned all around.
Amazing. Yeah. Very important piece of technology, and important value proposition here to solve interop across rollups. We speak quite frequently about this vision, this feeling that seems to be in the air, that with modularity, a lot more rollups will start to pop up. And now with application specific rollups, all kinds of specific use cases tailored for certain use cases and communities. It seems and it feels that we're on the precipice of this like so-called Cambrian explosion of rollups, and that because like modularity unlocks new scalability, we will see new applications on their own rollups serving these applications with the new scale. And that's to say that the interop across these rollups is mega important to give it a user experience that feels smooth and seamless. Without that, we fall prey to the fragmentation problem. One of the things that I found most interesting about the panel I saw you on at Modular Day in Istanbul was this idea of atomic composability. And this is something that Andy and I have been trying to get to the root of in a few of our recent episodes, is the difference between atomic composability, atomic composability being the umbrella term, and then the difference between atomic execution and atomic inclusion. And this is something that you kind of opened my eyes to when I first heard about it. So I'd love to hear about atomic inclusion, atomic execution, how those are possible with the Espresso shared sequencer network, and why that unlocks new value in rollup interoperability.
Yeah, that's a great question, Rob. So like I said, we believe that shared sequencing that is super synergistic with various bridging solutions. It does make various interoperability use cases much easier. It isn't a silver bullet. It doesn't solve everything, but it does make things a lot easier. And at the core of that is this question of, does shared sequencing provide atomic inclusion? Does it provide atomic execution? And that's something really important to understand. So why don't we go over that? So first of all, let's imagine a situation where, so let's say Andy, you have 10 ethers on Arbitrum, and Robbie has a Pudgy Penguin NFT, and let's say that's on like an NFT rollup, maybe let's say like Zora, for instance. And you guys want to do a trade for that without having to trust a third party, like without having to transfer the funds to like an exchange or like some centralized exchange or transfer the NFT anywhere. And keep in mind, these are on different rollups. So Andy has some funds on Arbitrum, and he wants to use those to pay for an NFT on another rollup that Robbie has. So what we need here is this concept of atomicity. Atomicity meaning that if Andy makes a transaction to send Rob the 10 ether, and Rob makes a transaction to send the NFT to Andy, we want those two transactions to either both go through or for neither of them to go through. It would be a huge problem if only one of them were to go through. Either Andy would be losing out on his money or Rob would be losing out on the NFT. Obviously, since if two rollups have different sequencers, that is a problem, because you have two basically entities deciding the inclusion or exclusion of these transactions, and you really have no idea to trust that you have no idea to coordinate between these two sequencers to make sure that they either both include them or neither of them include them. And you also have to worry about malicious activity, like the sequencer is not doing what they say. So let's imagine that the two rollups share the same shared sequencer, and this shared sequencer has support for what's called atomic bundles, which Espresso is able to support with minimal changes to the rollups execution layer, for that matter. And if anyone wants to go into the more technical details on this, we actually recently released a post called the derivation pipeline on our HackMD that kind of goes into the more technical details of how we accomplish that, how we translate the sequencer's output into the rollup blocks. But anyways, back to the higher level, atomic inclusion. So keep in mind, this is inclusion, not atomic execution. Basically, is the idea that, let's say Andy has created this transaction, Rob has created this transaction. So let's say we have transaction A and transaction B. The idea is that both are included, or that neither of them are included within the same block. Now note that I'm saying inclusion. The problem is that these transactions could fail. So let's say right before these transactions are executed, let's say Andy has already transferred away all of his ether and he no longer has the 10 ether to send. Then Andy's transaction could actually fail, even though both are included. And in a shared sequencer model, and we can discuss this a little bit later, but the way that Espresso is designed, and pretty much all shared sequencers that want to significantly improve throughput are designed, is that they do not handle execution, and they're pretty much blind to this rollup state. So they actually do not do any validation of the transaction. So Espresso, while it is able to guarantee that both transactions are included, it cannot guarantee that both transactions are going to successfully execute. And that's what is meant by atomic execution. So we aren't completely there yet. Now you might be wondering, what value does a shared sequencer actually add then in that case, if it only guarantees inclusion, but it doesn't guarantee that the two transactions are both valid? That is kind of where building comes in. By combining a shared sequencer with a builder, with like an economically incentivized block builder, we can actually do wonderful things with interoperability. And for the listeners who are maybe a little less familiar about this idea of building, the idea is that basically, if you've heard of like flashbots or anything like that, or like builders. What users, what happens in like many chains right now, such as Ethereum, is while there is a public mempool that users can submit transactions to, that is completely public and anyone can see those transactions, there are also protocols that allow users to basically coordinate kind of in another channel, in a non-public channel, and to basically, builders are offering this service to users to allow them to have a little bit more fine-grained control over when their transactions are included, or say under what conditions they're included. So users could coordinate with a builder to say, okay, I only want, like, Andy and Rob could, you could coordinate with a builder on Espresso to say, I only want these transactions to be included if both of them are included at the same time and that they're both valid, and I'll pay you a little bit for the service. So builders are getting a small cut by providing the service, by providing this extra guarantee that both will be executed successfully at the same time. And builders can also put down like a bond to make sure that they follow through on their word. And there are ways to enforce that this bond is lost if, let's say, the builder only processes Andy's transaction but not Rob's. Anyways, I'm being a little wordy here, but yeah, please interrupt.
Charles, I remember the good old proof of work days of Ethereum when I pay the highest gas, and if my transaction has higher gas than someone else, then my transaction gets executed before theirs. When did that change, and why is that important difference now?
Yeah. So I think I'm kind of forgetting my my timelines here, but I think it's been at least a few years now where people realize that as soon as things like Uniswap started showing up on Ethereum, people realized that you could basically front run people by kind of bumping up the gas a little bit higher, such that your transaction was in front of some innocent user. So let's imagine like you're trying to buy a large amount of Ethereum for DAI on Uniswap on Ethereum, and you're a big whale. You have a lot of money, and naturally, by trading with an AMM, your transaction is going to push the price of Ethereum, or let's say a less liquid token, because Ether is super liquid, but obviously it depends on the liquidity of the token. But let's say you're trying to buy a token, and your buy order is huge. It's going to pump the price way up. What people realize is that, as you said, if you just put, before the block is created, before that transaction is included in a block, if you see that transaction in a public mempool, because remember, this is a decentralized system, as long as you're part of the network, you're probably going to see the transaction. You can calculate, okay, I can just create a transaction to buy a smaller amount of that same coin, pay a slightly higher gas fee so that it goes in front of this big buy order from an innocent user, and then schedule a transaction right after to sell that coin after the price has been pushed up. And you can basically get a guaranteed profit at the expense of that user. So that is when, these sorts of services, these building services, kind of sprung up, both for the benefit of users, but also for the benefit of people running these, sort of sandwich attacks or arbitrages to help them better, have better fine-grained control over their transactions. Now, let's go back to the multi-rollup setting, the setting where you have, that we were discussing earlier, where you have two rollups, and you want to ensure that these transactions go through at the same time. The problem is that, let's say there's still a public mempool here. Let's say Andy signs his transaction and Rob signs, you sign your transaction, and you both, you want those two to execute atomically, meaning both or neither. You definitely cannot send those to the public mempool, because anyone can look at those transactions in the mempool and they can take them and do whatever they want. So let's say, even if like you're putting them into like, say, like a signed atomic bundle, as long as they're individually valid, you have a big problem on your hands. So either you need some way of enforcing that by a shared sequencer, or you need like changes to the rollups execution environments to support these bundles, which is a whole nother question. But anyways, this is the fundamental challenge, and that's kind of why you need a builder. So let's imagine you have a builder now. You have a building service that both of you are coordinating with to make sure that these two transactions are atomic. Let's say these two rollups, let's say Arbitrum and Zora, are not running on the same sequencer. They actually are running their own sequencers. Then the builder basically needs to coordinate with both of these sequencers in order to get a guarantee that the builder can have a say in what is going to go into the next block on each of these rollups. And this can introduce a lot of risk for the builder because they're needing to coordinate with both of these sequencers. They can't get a guarantee from a single sequencer of whether both transactions on both rollups are going to go through at the same time. And to that end, like, it introduces a lot of risk, especially if the builder is putting a lot of money on the line. Usually I would expect users to expect builders to put down a pretty significant economic bond such that, if only one of those transactions, like if only Rob transfers your NFT to Andy, but doesn't get payment, like, you would want the builder to lose a lot of collateral. So this introduces a lot of risk. So that's where the shared sequencer comes in. If the two rollups are basically using the same sequencer, then it makes the job for builders much easier and much less risky, because they really only need to coordinate with one sequencer here, and they can get a clear guarantee whether or not both of these transactions are going to go in at the same time. And it's not just limited to like 2 rollup transactions. Like, you could have multi-rollup transactions where you want to do one thing atomically across many rollups, and that's where you have the value out of a shared sequencer is just so immense in that case.
Right. Okay. And so unpacking that then, does that multi-rollup scenario apply similarly for a decentralized sequencer and a shared? And then, like, how is Espresso doing decentralized and shared sequencing? Like, could you just break those two concepts down for the community, kind of unpack the differences in possibilities with, having the two separated and then also the two together in Espresso's model?
Yeah, absolutely. So I would say they're pretty orthogonal. So they're kind of on different dimensions. So we can just go through toy examples to kind of give a sense of what these really mean. A shared sequencer really just means multiple rollups being sequenced by the same entity. It can be decentralized, it can be a centralized sequencer, it can be like a single server, in fact. So imagine like, Arbitrum or multiple rollups basically just using the same sequencer. And as we just went over in that previous example, just the fact that they share a sequencer, it doesn't matter if it's decentralized or not, does make various aspects of interoperability easier. Now let's go to the decentralized side. So let's imagine it's not shared, but it's just decentralized. And of course, there are different degrees of decentralization, right? You could do a simple model where you are basically just rotating. You're doing like sort of leader rotation, where the role of ordering transactions is just cycled between different nodes over time. So let's say, one address is responsible for proposing the ordering of transactions for one block, and then you cycle to another. That is actually doesn't provide as many advantages as we want, because there is no real consensus, and it's still possible for, like, if there's no consensus on the orderings. And what I mean by consensus is that the nodes as a whole agreeing on this order. In this sort of just simple rotation model, there still is a lot of trust that is required to trust any individual node on like finality. So what is even better is to actually have a consensus protocol that actually agrees on whatever the leader proposes. And that is kind of what Espresso is doing. We are decentralizing the sequencer, and we're actually using a consensus protocol called Hotshot that has properties that are kind of perfect for sequencing in order to do that. And that I'll go into that a little bit more later. And then, of course, on the most extreme end, you have this concept of based sequencing, which is just using the L1 itself to order. Of course, there are advantages there, but there are also disadvantages. So, for instance, like, let's say you were to use Ethereum as the sequencer. So Ethereum itself has a lot of advantages, right? It's maximally decentralized. It's it's maximally aligned, but at the same time, it doesn't have very fast finality. So like even though the block times are quite fast, like on the order of 10, 12 seconds, the actual finality of Ethereum's consensus protocol is actually around 15 minutes. It's people often say it's 12 seconds, but it's actually 15 minutes. So you actually don't have certainty around finalization until 15 minutes, and that's kind of one of the key disadvantages of using based sequencing on Ethereum. But going back to what we're doing with Espresso, we're using Hotshot, which is a decentralized protocol that is based on Hot Stuff, which is like a BFT protocol for consensus that has a few properties. The most important one being optimistic responsiveness. What that means is that there's actually no block time, and in optimistic conditions, in good conditions where the network is highly connected, and sequencer nodes are have good network conditions, their throughput is very high, we can actually create blocks as quickly as the network allows, and we can finalize those blocks almost immediately. And that is super important for rollups, because rollup users demand to know that their transactions are final really, really quickly. As soon as they place a trade on like a DEX, on Arbitrum or something, or GMX, they want to know exactly whether that trade executed. They want to know at what price it executed, and they want a guarantee of that very, very quickly. And Hotshot is able to provide this. At the same time, we're also able to scale to thousands of nodes, which is really amazing that a consensus protocol that has such fast and low latency and has such high throughput can also scale to such a large number of nodes, which is extremely important for for Ethereum alignment and for true decentralization. And that's also what enables us to use restaking for more Ethereum alignment. The fact that we support so many nodes. So we think what we're doing with Hotshot is kind of at like the perfect spot in the design space for a balance of like throughput, for a balance of performance, as well as Ethereum alignment, as well as decentralization. So that's kind of the decentralized side. And just the mere fact that multiple rollups can use Espresso, it's kind of like a neutral shared infrastructure, makes it like a sort of, it's like a shared and decentralized sequencer. And more practically speaking, we already have several rollup integrations. We have integrations with many rollup stacks. We have our first. We're currently on our third testnet, and actually, I think by the time this podcast is out, we'll have released our fourth testnet, Gibraltar, which has an Arbitrum Nitro integration. The previous testnets had OP Stack and Polygon integrations, and I believe our previous testnet was like the first sort of demo of like a shared decentralized sequencer with rollups from multiple stacks, specifically OP Stack and Polygon Stack, running on the same infrastructure. So pretty cool, and I'm super excited for what's to come. But anyway, sorry to go on so long, but hope that gives a good sense of the question.
What, Charles, when rollups integrate Espresso's Hotshot and they plug into this decentralized shared sequencer, are rollups contributing to a combined mempool made up of multiple rollups transactions?
Yeah, that's completely correct. So there's basically like a total ordering that is generated by the sequencer, that is output by the sequencer, and then rollups can interpret that ordering however they want, and that kind of goes into like the more technical derivation pipeline that I had mentioned earlier.
Very cool. And then so then could you kind of reconstruct how finality is generated? Now it makes sense. We have all of these rollups contributing transactions into this combined mempool. And then, if it was just Ethereum's mempool, there would be this process of proposing and then building and then gossiping those blocks and arriving at consensus. Could you reconstruct how consensus is arrived in Espresso's mempool?
Yeah, actually, I think one related question that the listeners might be wondering is like, why do we even need a sequencer? Like, why don't we just use Ethereum for sequencing, or why don't we use like Solana or something like that? Um, and and more generally, like the question is like, what is the purpose of the modular stack? Is it actually better than a monolithic solution? And basically, the intuition behind this whole idea and behind why you would want a purpose-built sequencer is fundamentally, like, all blockchains are basically like state machine replication systems. The idea is that there's a distributed network of nodes, and they all agree on the state, and users are able to submit transactions to that state. And the network needs to do a few things. So first of all, they need to do consensus. They need to, and that basically means to agree on the ordering of the transactions. And then secondly, they need to, as you said, they need to disseminate the data. They need to broadcast that data to every node in the network, or at least every honest node. And then finally, the third step is they need to execute those transactions. So they've agreed on the ordering, they have broadcast the data, and then they need to execute all the transactions. And these three actually requirements, so consensus, data broadcast, and execution, they're actually separate. And in typical monolithic blockchains, so like Ethereum, Solana, pretty much every layer one basically handles all three. But the problem is that the overall performance of the blockchain then is basically bottlenecked by the slowest of these three. And that's kind of the intuition behind why you might want to split up these roles. So for instance, let's think about what Espresso or any sequencer is really doing. A sequencer doesn't really need to satisfy all three of these requirements. In the case of a sequencer like Espresso, basically users are submitting transactions to the rollup, and then these transactions end up in the mempool. It's like as you said, it's like a shared mempool. The sequencer retrieves these, and then it basically outputs a finalized list of transactions in that ordering, in the ordering that the sequencer produces, and then the rollups themselves, not the sequencers, execute the transactions. So, what is the key point here? Basically, the key point here is that the sequencer doesn't need to execute or even validate the transactions. And that is really key because it basically takes out one of these requirements that a typical L1 would have from being a bottleneck. And we can even relax the just to summarize, we no longer have the execution requirement, and we can even relax the sort of data availability requirement as well. We no longer need to have the sequencer nodes basically broadcast the transaction data to all of the sequencer nodes because they no longer need to execute. We do need to ensure that the data is available for the rollups and their users to execute. That is basically the data availability problem, and that's why there's so many data availability solutions and why it's such a big question right now. But considering these three requirements, we do need to ensure an agreement on ordering. So the sequencer nodes need to come to an agreement on ordering. There's sort of a relaxed data availability in that the sequencer nodes don't actually need to broadcast the transaction data to all of them. We only need to ensure that the data is available to those who need it. And finally, we don't need to do execution at all. So even though you can implement a sequencer using like any state machine replication system, basically any blockchain can be used as a sequencer, we can make a much more efficient and much simpler system. And that is what Espresso is trying to do. And with this relaxed data availability requirement, with the lack of need to execute, consensus is really the only bottleneck. And we've basically put all our efforts into making sure the consensus, which as I mentioned is hotshot, is basically perfect for this use case of sequencing, in that we can support as high throughput as possible in good network conditions. And also, have very fast pre-confirmations, very low latency, while also being able to scale to many nodes. And the way we do that is actually hotshot. The nodes are actually only responsible for agreeing on a short commitment to the ordered block. We don't even, as I mentioned, the sequencer nodes don't actually need to download all the data. And we also have what we call tiramisu. It's like a sort of multi-layered. We call it tiramisu because it's multi-layered. It's a multi-layered DA that supports the sequencer running in parallel to ensure that data is available for those who need it. But anyways, that's sort of the approach that we're taking and why we are able to kind of maximize the throughput whilst still having a very decentralized system.
Yeah, and I think there's definitely a strong focus on the decentralization of that system, which is very important, right? Even some people struggle to understand now, kind of what you said earlier with regards to even just things like optimistic rollups not using fraud proofs and rollups having centralized sequencers, things that we're working towards. And Vitalik gave a speech about it in Istanbul. It was on a panel. And I think it's something that a lot of people are thinking about now. But the thing that I'm not really understanding from this with regards to the switch is like, how does that happen? How do you take, like, let's say Optimism or Arbitrum or any of these rollups that have a ton of transactions, users, volumes, etc. How do you switch the sequencer from the current setup to something like Espresso without downtime, with seamlessly, and ensuring that there's no kind of points for MEV or malicious attacks? Like, what does this transition from the current state to the future state using decentralized shared sequencers look like?
That is a great question, Andy, and it's the exact migration and how that is going to look like when the time comes is honestly something that we have not finalized yet. But I can tell you a little bit about what we are doing to work towards that goal. So late last year, we actually spent a lot of effort working on the OP stack. The Optimism Foundation had a RFP, a request for proposals for sort of their sequencer module, their decentralized sequencer selection module. We actually won that, and we spent a lot of effort sort of working on that part of the OP stack and working on the part specifically where you can plug in any sequencer you want, and that is going to have that is not yet merged into main, but we're working on that, and hopefully that will be soon, and that will be super helpful for not just OP stack rollups that want to have flexibility and have their choice around what sequencer to use, but hopefully it will be used in the future for Optimism mainnet as well. On the Arbitrum side, we've been working hard with Off-Chain Labs, which is the original developers of Arbitrum and the Arbitrum technology. We have a partnership with them, not just on integrating Espresso with Arbitrum, but also working on decentralized time boost. So time boost is a protocol for transaction ordering that Off-Chain Labs introduced, and we're working on bringing that in a decentralized setting, and also adding the option for sort of threshold encryption on transactions, which does help with the MEV issue, as you mentioned, Andy. So these are just baby steps. We're primarily working on integrations of the technology stacks right now. When the time comes, and when large rollups with tons of transactions do decide to make the switch to a more decentralized system, be it Espresso or something else. Obviously, there's going to be a huge upgrade process. We're going to need to go through governance procedures, and that is something. Those are things we're all thinking about right now. But still a lot of work to do.
What is the value proposition to the current recipients of the sequencer revenue, and does the transition to a shared sequencer and a decentralized sequencer undercut the revenue that these rollups are bringing in now? If so, what's the proposal or the value proposition to these rollups as to why they would transition?
Yeah, like, is decentralization enough of an incentive, or is there something else?
Yeah, that's a great question, and there are a few points I want to make. But yeah, this is frequently a concern that I hear. It is a conception that, okay, since the sequencer is the entity that decides the transaction ordering, then therefore the sequencer must capture all the MEV, and therefore they're going to take all the fees. And I believe that is sort of a misconception. It's kind of thinking at the first layer, but it's not really thinking deeper. First of all, sequencers are regardless of whichever sequencer is chosen. That sequencer is definitely going to make sure that rollups are as good off. Rollups and their users and their stakeholders are as well off as they would have been without. Whether that is through intangibles like decentralization, as you mentioned, or actual revenue numbers, or both. Rollups are going to need to be incentivized to buy into a decentralized sequencer network. And while the costs of operation of a decentralized network may be higher, not only are you getting advantages, but you're also getting increased revenue by the fact that you're generating more value by the fact that rollups can now plug into a shared sequencer, and you now have all of this cross rollup activity that is willing to pay higher fees. So that's the thinking there. So first of all, like, rollups are not going to buy into a system where they're worse off. Everyone is a rational actor, and for these things to go through governance, definitely the vast majority of value is still going to need to go back to rollup stakeholders and their users. And secondly, the thinking is with a shared sequencer, you're actually generating more value from these cross rollup transactions, whether it be arbitrages, which can generate a ton of value. Let's say you have prices trading at different, assets trading at different prices on different rollups. There's a lot of value there, and people are maybe willing to pay much higher fees for those types of transactions where they're where they have high profit potential, and that's another source of revenue that a shared sequencer can unlock. Obviously, that more comes from the shared aspect rather than the decentralization aspect. But if you think about it, for a sequencer to really be neutral and to be credibly neutral and also trusted as sort of like a public infrastructure, it kind of needs to be decentralized for multiple rollups to buy in. So that's the thinking there.
So would the easier, more seamless interoperability that also could play a part, especially for these things like Arbitrum, who has Orbit with their L3, ZK Sync has ZK Stack. Obviously, when you bring in ZK, I think there's a little bit of difference with regards to how the sequencing and proving works, but what you're kind of suggesting, I think, is that there's advantages not only on the economic but also on potentially like the UX or composability fronts that make it a very justifiable cause, in addition to just the decentralization aspect. Kind of going even further on that interop subject, I'm not sure if you touched deep into kind of how you guys are thinking about these rollups then transitioning to a decentralized shared sequencer, let's say, down the line, and then how do these rollups then communicate with each other? What does this look like for bridges? And in this world that I'm kind of trying to push forward for you with your mental model, like what does the L2 to L2 communication then look like?
Yeah, that's a great question. So as I mentioned, shared sequencing, we do get atomic inclusion, and with economically incentivized builders, we can achieve atomic execution as well. That alone does not mean we don't need bridges. In fact, we actually still need bridges. It's just that the fact that two rollups share the same shared sequencer makes running a bridge easier. It can provide better guarantees. The bridges can provide better guarantees. They can operate faster. Bridges right now, many still require time. They need to wait on both rollups. They need to wait quite a while, depending on the trust assumptions, to ensure that the bridging is final. And the fact that two rollups can share the same sequencer brings a number of advantages on security and finality. So just to give an example, right? if two rollups were to share the same sequencer, one advantage on the security side is that it actually makes certain types of attacks impossible. So the basic way, like let's say you're trying to bridge one asset from rollup A to rollup B, what you're generally going to do is you're going to lock up your asset. So let's say it's a stable coin like USDC. You're basically going to lock up your USDC on rollup A, let's say Arbitrum. You're going to lock that in a contract, a bridge contract. And then on rollup B, the same bridge contract on rollup B, let's say Optimism, is going to check the contract on rollup A, check that you've actually locked up the USDC. And then only then, once it's sure that you've locked it up, it's going to mint some wrapped USDC on Optimism after that you can use. Now, for the bridge to be secure, it needs to be absolutely certain that your transaction where you locked up your USDC on rollup A is not going to revert. Because if it's reverted, then you basically have that USDC and you have the wrapped USDC on both rollups, and then you basically doubled your money at the expense of the bridge. So now let's think about that if the two rollups are sharing the same sequencer. If the two rollups are sharing the same sequencer, then even if you did manage to roll up your transaction on rollup A where you locked up your USDC, that would also revert the rollup B as well, because they're running on the same sequencer. So obviously, this is just a simple example. It is one type of attack. It obviously doesn't stop all of the attacks, but this is just an example where shared sequencing kind of makes bridging easier. Another thing is like fast finality, right? So as I've mentioned, what we're trying to do with Espresso is we're trying to provide as fast finality as possible, so that as soon as the sequencer outputs an ordering of transactions, users can basically be sure that that sequence is final within seconds. And that is really something that you can only do with consensus amongst a very decentralized set of nodes, because in the current model where rollups have centralized sequencers, it can be difficult, or it can be risky to trust that those sequencers, as soon as they output something, they're just never going to change that and they're never going to revert that. It's much easier to trust an incentivized group of proof of stake nodes with a lot of money on the line that the consensus is going to work and that 2/3 of the stake is honest. So the fact that we have fast finality through Espresso also means that bridges can function much more quickly. Even if only one rollup out of the two rollups that you're trying to bridge between is using Espresso, you still have this guarantee of fast finality, and that's super important.
So, how would canonical bridges fit in compared to using something like Espresso in terms of like security and decentralization for this bridging situation? Like, or is the canonical bridge technically still more secure than the shared sequencing network, or is it a gradient? I'm just trying to really understand the level of trust which is required in this system compared to interop using the OG Ethereum L1 to Arbitrum bridge, or like the original bridge.
Yeah, I mean, I think it totally depends on your trust assumptions, right? So what Espresso is providing is still a pre-confirmation, and ultimately the ultimate arbiter is still the layer one. And unfortunately, the problem with the layer one is that the true finality from the layer one could take days or not weeks, right? And if you really want to just let's say you wanted to move assets from like Arbitrum to Optimism, without going through like a bridge, without having to basically by bridging back from Arbitrum to Ethereum layer one and then wrapping it into Optimism. I mean, that's probably going to take like a couple weeks. So that's just not very practical. So the question is, if you're using a bridge, what are the assumptions under which you're bridging, and what is the bridge comfortable with trusting in terms of a guarantee that a transaction is not going to be reverted? And it's a lot. The claim I'm making is that it's a lot easier to trust Hotshot rather than an arbitrary centralized. especially for a smaller rollup. Users may be very willing to trust off-chain labs, which run Arbitrum because they're a well-known entity in the space. But as more and more rollups come up, you may not know who's running the sequencer, and it's just so incredibly easy to for a malicious actor to first who's running a sequencer to first commit to an ordering and broadcast that ordering to users, and then a few seconds later just completely change that. Whereas if you have a consensus protocol like Hotshot, you would actually need more than 1/3 of the stake to be dishonest and to completely coordinate to attack the consensus in order to change any ordering after something's considered final. And that is extremely difficult, especially if you have a lot of economic stake behind that. And that reason is actually why we think restaking is so important, such an important part of the puzzle, is because if you're able to empower Ethereum validators to support in running the sequencer network, that is a ton of economic security right there. So that's kind of the thinking about why we designed Espresso.
I think this next question will relate to restaking Ethereum validators. I'm curious, in Espresso's consensus mechanism, is there another validator that's added into the mix? Let's say Optimism and Arbitrum are plugging into Espresso. Arbitrum's got its set of validators, Optimism's got its set of validators. And for them to interact with each other in Espresso, are Arbitrum validators communicating and interacting directly with Optimism validators? Or is there a third node in this system that is handling communications across the rollups?
Yeah, can you hear me, by the way? I think there's some change.
Yeah, we can hear you fine now.
Okay, all right, cool. I think you're hinting at a very important concept here. So if Arbitrum and Optimism were to plug into Espresso, the actual consensus on the ordering of transactions would be basically finalized by the same set of nodes. And that would include, that would basically be Espresso sequencer nodes, and some of those would be based on restaked Ethereum validators. And then, I think kind of on that thread that you were going down, this idea of builders, I guess, could be considered a separate type of node, where you might want a builder to provide an extra guarantee that two transactions are going to execute successfully. You might also have rollups might also choose to have different sort of MEV mitigation strategies, and that is something that Espresso totally supports. So, for instance, with the design around time boost, for instance, Arbitrum could support time boost, whereas Optimism might just not use time boost, and time boost or some other MEV mitigation strategy could be run by a separate committee as well. But we're building Espresso to be very flexible and basically pluggable with any sort of MEV mitigation approach.
Nice. Kind of taking even further there, we were speaking with Marston and some of the other guys from Cartesi, and they were mentioning that Espresso specifically fits well with the Cartesi VM, and kind of shifting gears into how you guys are positioning for this kind of modular thesis and this modular future. How does Espresso fit in with non-EVM virtual machines? And also, how does Espresso fit in with data availability layers? I know that we've touched on this a bit, but I want to start with Cartesi and also other alternative VMs and kind of how the system that you guys have built works with non-EVM virtual machines.
Yeah, great question. So first of all, Cartesi is super cool. We've been our team has been working with theirs extensively for our last couple test sets, and it's super cool. So just for the listeners who haven't looked into it yet, Cartesi is basically working on application specific rollups, but the key thing there is that there's a Linux runtime behind it. So they actually have their own VM that's like a RISC-V runtime that runs Linux, and that like significantly, like dramatically expands the design space of possible applications. One example actually in our last testnet that we integrated with Cesti on the Espresso side, or actually Cesti did the integration, is that I think Carson was actually the one who put a Rickroll video through the sequencer. So that was like a 20 megabyte video compared to like a typical like EVM transaction, which is like, on the order of hundreds of bytes. So it's like, it's like 100,000 times bigger. And that sort of gives an idea of like what might be possible with Cesti. So super, super cool. And in order to support that, if you want to both be, sort of decentralized and have the benefits of being decentralized, while also being able to support that, you need a super, super performant sequencer protocol. And you also need a very, very robust DA solution. And that is once again what we're trying to optimize for with Hotshot. We're taking data availability off the off the main blocking path, and we are trying to make things run as quick as possible, as quickly as the network allows. So that's really the core idea there. And you also had a great question, which was, is this limited to only EVM rollups? Is it limited to only Ethereum rollups, or does it work with anything? And I should have been a little bit more clear about that earlier. Espresso actually works with pretty much anything. Once again, it's kind of agnostic to the rollup type. It's agnostic to the rollup state or the execution environment. We really work with arbitrary data. And the whole idea behind Espresso is just to make it do one thing simply as good as possible. And that job is basically to come to agreement on the ordering of any data, any transaction types, and basically provide fast finality for that. You can in fact think of Espresso as a fast finality layer, because that's really what we're doing. So yeah, Espresso is designed to work with pretty much any type of rollup. It doesn't need to be Ethereum.
And then
now,
sorry,
yeah, go on, Andy. Yeah.
No, I was just gonna say, I think you're getting to it. So the DA layer is interesting as well, and then also like, yeah, let's just start there. So then, how does that work?
Yeah, so as I mentioned, we are kind of dealing with a sort of relaxed data availability problem. So we do not need to make sure that the transaction data is disseminated to all of the sequencer nodes. That would be pretty inefficient, and that would probably be the bottleneck. And in fact, that is the bottleneck in a lot of L1s. What we do need to ensure, though, for the sequencer to work is that the data is available for those who need it. So specifically, rollups themselves need to be able to get the rollup, get the transaction data. So we do have a system, a DA solution that's running in parallel with Hotshot called Tiramisu. And the reason we call it Tiramisu is because we actually have 3 layers with varying trust assumptions. So like we have a very, very decentralized DA system that is very bribery resistant, and then we have one that is much more efficient, but uses committees, so it's a little less bribery resistant. And we have one that's like super, super fast, that's kind of facilitated by like a more centralized sort of CDN. But that's what we call Tiramisu. And that is like integrated with Hotshot, and that Hotshot would, the sequencer will not function without it. But that being said, we know that rollups want to use their choice of DA. Whether that be Ethereum, they might trust Ethereum and nothing else, or they might want to use something like Celestia, or they might want to use EigenDA or Avail. And data availability is super additive. My opinion is like the more you have, the better, and the better guarantees you have. Obviously, it might cost a little bit more, especially if you're using Ethereum, but DA is additive, and Espresso is compatible with all of them.
So Espresso fully embraces the modularism, not maximalism mentality, but also with tech stack, like pretty much fully compatible with with any rollup settling to Ethereum, regardless of the DA or VM. Is that
Yeah,
right?
absolutely. Yeah, and I would say not even just settling to Ethereum. While we are validating basically the output of the hotshot consensus, we are working on a smart contract to kind of validate that as a sort of public good. And that is on Ethereum. That could also be deployed on pretty much any other chain. We are doing like a EVM implementation, but it could be verified on any other chain. So I would not even limit it to only Ethereum settled rollups.
Nice. Okay, so then jumping out of the weeds into the practical terms, what's on the menu for Espresso in the coming months? Obviously, we've got one more testnet. How are you guys looking to go about integrations in getting the shared sequencing network to mainnet? What is that looking like for the team, for the tech? What's on the menu?
Yeah, super, super excited. So as I mentioned, around the time, this podcast comes out, we're going to have our fourth testnet out that we're calling Gibraltar. And the key points there are, so first of all, we have the Arbitrum Nitro integration. We have a lot of progress on VID, so verifiable information dispersal. That's like sort of the key behind one of the layers of Tiramisu DA. The idea is to kind of move transaction dissemination off of the critical path while still giving the DA guarantees. So it'll do a ton for efficiency, and that will go live basically right around the time this podcast is out. We're working with Caldera to deploy rollups from multiple stacks, so both the Arbitrum and OP stacks on Gibraltar, and we'll also have a Polygon zk VM instance. We're working with Altlayer as well on deploying rollups, and Cesti has also built an integration. And Gibraltar will also be the first testnet that we're running with external node operators. In this case, Blockdaemon is working with us. So super cool and super exciting. We'll follow that up shortly with another testnet in a couple months called Cappuccino. By the way, we'll be at ETH Denver, and we'll be presenting a demo around interoperability. We'll be working with some interoperability bridging solutions and demoing how a shared sequencer can help. So basically what we were talking about for much of today. And shortly after Cappuccino, we're planning on releasing basically a production version of the sequencer, but running on a temporarily fixed set of nodes, and we're calling that decaf. But the idea is that it'll be in production at that point, and real rollups are going to be running on it with real value. And later this year, we're going to migrate that to a mainnet for the Espresso sequencer. So super busy year. We have a lot planned, a lot to do, and working really hard on everything ranging from the core consensus hotshot to integrations. We're working with many teams on integrating their stacks. We're working with various rollup as a service companies as well to make sure that it's easy to use Espresso. If you're a rollup or a rollup as a service company and you're interested, definitely check us out at espressosys.com. We have a button you can click at the top to participate as a rollup or a node operator. So definitely check us out. And there's a lot to do this year, and I think so much about the modular stack is slowly coming to fruition. So I think the environment and the user experience and the ecosystem is going to look very, very different, within a year. So it's super exciting.
Right.
Very
Cool. Get ready for Modular March, Rob.
Let's go, Modular March. Yeah, Charles. I mean, it was really cool to hear you, like scope out the modular landscape, and also unpack like those three work streams that are happening on every rollup at every level. Consensus, ordering, and settlement. I mean, like we speak quite a bit about parallelization, and by unpacking those, you're able to run them in parallel, and then you're able to even further scale each of those work streams by only specializing on one piece. So it's very, very cool to hear your mental model and the architecture you envision for Espresso and how it fits into the rest of the modular ecosystem.
Yeah, it was super fun to discuss, and if anyone has any questions, or if either of you have any questions, would love to continue discussing. So definitely reach out. And it was a huge pleasure to be on. And thanks so much for the invite.
Are you going to East Denver, Charles?
I will be there, yeah, and we'll actually be putting together a side event. Several members of the Espresso Systems team will be there as well. Looking forward to seeing everyone.
That's it, man.
Love to meet up in Denver, and absolutely our pleasure. Thanks for coming on.
Cool. Thanks a bunch.